So the F word, Kamal, fascist. Kamala Harris has used it to describe Donald Trump in a televised town hall event on Wednesday night with Anderson Cooper of CNN fame. That took place in Pennsylvania. And, well, she was very clear in her opinion of her political opponent.
You've quoted General Milley calling Donald Trump a fascist. You yourself have not used that word to describe him. Let me ask you tonight, do you think Donald Trump is a fascist?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do. And I also believe that the people who know him best on this subject should be trusted.
Certainly a change of tone. Do you remember that when Kamala Harris first started her campaign to be president, the new way of attacking Trump was that he was weird, not dangerous? Well, they've certainly gone back to dangerous. Anderson Cooper was talking about the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who said in a new book by the reporter Bob Woodward, one of the journalists who broke the Watergate scandal, that Trump was fascist to the core. So Kamala Harris has clearly decided to double down on this F word, and her remarks followed an interview with Trump's former Chief of Staff, General John Kelly. Here he is speaking to New York Times reporter Mike Schmidt.
Do you think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm looking at the definition of fascism. It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultranationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. Certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
And John Kelly continued in that interview with the New York Times, saying that he'd had conversations with Trump in which the former president spoke positively of Hitler, saying more than once apparently that, quotes, Hitler did some good things too. Interesting that Kelly is using the sort of Wikipedia definition of fascism. It's largely based on the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's probably much simpler, Kamal, to look at the Oxford English Dictionary definition of what fascism is. I quote, fascism is an extreme right-wing political system or attitude that is in favour of strong central government, aggressively promoting your own country or race above others, and that does not allow any opposition.
I'm sure the debate in America is very different from the debate in Europe for very obvious reasons. Here, we have had fascism in our recent history in Italy and, of course, most horrifically in Germany. Those connotations are so horrific that it almost appears to debase the language to talk about somebody who is standing in a democratic election in America, that they are a fascist. But when the leader of the Democrats uses the word against the leader of the Republicans, we do have to have a discussion about what could Donald Trump's next administration look like.
I mean, when you look at that definition, it's partially true to an extent, isn't it? He is extremely right-wing. He certainly aggressively promotes America first. The race point, though, I mean, is his anti-immigration stance, is that characterised as putting his own race above others? I'm not sure.
I don't get that sense in a way that fascism would have in it, which was that the European white race was better than all others. Donald Trump has certainly used some of the tones of what might be described as nativism, which is about American culture and people who are American citizens being more valued, for example, than immigrants. There are certainly as well elements of authoritarianism in how Trump creates his arguments about why he should be the next president. You've got attacks on the media. You've got attacks on democratic institutions, the judiciary. Also, this identification of the enemy within, who in quotes, hate our country, in this case, usually illegal immigrants or sometimes all immigrants, and the idea of a strong man to solve the nation's ills. So the idea that Trump is America, and almost messianic leader, often very strong connections with sort of religion and faith. And as you say, these quotes, like he's actually said he wants to be a dictator on day one. The issue for me is, how seriously can you take any part of the accusation that he is actually a fascist when so much of this, for the public in America, is just Donald being Donald? Don't forget, we spoke the other day about him dancing to YMCA.
Yeah.
And he has this odd, he has so many different gears. He has sort of ludicrous Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And he also has frightening Donald Trump.
I mean, fascist. I don't know, the definition as well about not allowing any opposition. I mean, there is an opposition in America. Half the country, indeed half the world, is against this guy. So he hasn't got this sort of completely permissive, electorate upon which he rules as kind of, he fashions himself as a dictator, but he knows that half of the country is against him, which is not the same when you look back at sort of Nazi Germany and the rise of Hitler. The other thing is, I mean, isn't anarchist a better description? Isn't this guy just a chaos merchant? There's total inconsistency in his approach. As you say, 1 minute he's talking about sort of gun-toting and America first. The next he's dancing to YMCA. He has this, he's flipping burgers at McDonald's and then talking about sort of Putin appeasement. It's a chaos approach. It hasn't got the order of the proper old school style fascist dictators, does it?
Fraser Nelson, the former editor of The Spectator, who's now associate editor of The Spectator and a columnist for us, he makes a very interesting point in a piece he's written for The Telegraph today, which picks up on your point. America has a democratic system. It is a republic. It has incredibly powerful checks and balances against the power of the White House, because they were so fearful of dictatorship and of the return of a colonial power and the right to take arms. Not only is half of America against him, a lot of people in America are armed. And the idea in American culture that runs so deep is that if the center tries to control your life and tries to step over that line into what could be described as dictatorship, which of course is at the heart of fascism, it is not democratic, you take up arms, you go to war, this
Yes.
idea of civil war and the fight against the centre. And Trump plays a lot, which is in opposition to the idea of him being a fascist, which is all about centralised power. He plays a lot into this idea of devolving power. He talks about, well, Project 2025, which has been linked to the whole Trump programme, is all about devolving power, getting rid of civil servants, killing what might be described, or destroying what might be described here as the blob, the deep state. That needs to be blown up.
Yes. Also, it's not, the same as National Socialism or some of the communist dictatorships. Obviously, this idea of state economic control. This bloke is a capitalist. He's a free marketeer, so it doesn't quite fit in there. However, John Kelly makes a point, doesn't he? And you touched on it with this whole enemy within. And you could ask yourself, what other presidential nominee could we be talking about in the vein of mounting another insurrection? For whom would people have gone over the top on January the 6th, if not for Trump? And then, of course, it raises the spectre of, is there going to be another insurgency if this election is too close to call? Once again, we have Capitol riots. Having said that, the Kelly and Harris concern is that he could turn the military against the masses. And I don't think he's enabling the military. I think he's enabling his own MAGA, Make America Great Again mob. It's a slightly different thing, that, isn't it?
And we were speaking to Tony Diver, our US editor, last week about this idea of mobilizing the army and the National Guard against the enemy within. a lot of this is just political rhetoric, but it doesn't mean that he doesn't have authoritarian tendencies. As ever with Trump, he's a mix, isn't he? And sometimes he shows his naivety in that mix. When you were watching January the 6th, assaults on Congress, you saw Donald Trump struggling to really see what was going on. There was a naivety to him about the power invested in the president of the United States, like he almost didn't understand what he was releasing here. And John Bolton, the former US ambassador to the UN, who served in Trump's first administration as his national security advisor, he made the point that Trump wasn't deep thinking enough to be a fascist. He hadn't given enough thought to what he is. He doesn't really have an ideology. Let's listen to a bit of John Bolton. Here he is on CNN with Brianna Keeler, who asked whether Trump really did admire Hitler.
I think Trump doesn't think in philosophical or even policy terms. That gives him too much credit, too. So many things he said about history were based on no knowledge whatever. And after a while, I just didn't take them seriously.
Do you consider Trump a fascist? Because Milley clearly does.
Yeah, I think that requires believing Trump can think in a consistent philosophical framework for more than about 10 or 15 seconds, and it's just not possible.
Intriguingly, even though Telegraph readers, I think, are largely in support of Trump, regardless of all of their reservations versus Harris, when it comes to this issue of him being a fascist, the readers agree that he isn't a deep thinker, he isn't a philosopher, he doesn't have the consistency of thought to kind of mount the kind of regime that we would associate with the likes of Hitler and Mussolini and all the rest of it. Brian Sampson, who reads the paper, writes, Trump is not a well-read man and far from intellectual. Even his most strident supporters couldn't argue that. So his throwaway statements about history should be ignored. He doesn't know any history. Comments like those he made about Hitler are about as significant as a fart in the wind from him. A scholar praising Hitler would be a concern, however. He then makes a point, which I think is a good one, Kamal, about what motivates Trump really. Trump is an entrepreneur, and like many entrepreneurs, he just ploughs on without much nuance and gets where he gets to. Along the way, he'll blurt out some nonsense, but it doesn't matter. He's a better option for the Americans than Harris. Again, that's kind of exemplifying the contradiction at the heart of righties who are opposed to the Democrats but aren't quite happy with Trump either. I mean, fascist? No, I think exhibitionist, narcissist. They would be better words.
What will be vital is how he, Trump, and those around him respond if, as we expect, the election is very close. Now, it looks at this stage that Trump is the favourite to win, but if he loses, but only loses by a very narrow margin, does he use the language of steal the vote like 2020 to try and say that democracy hasn't worked? And that, of course, as I say, I'd rather use authoritarianism than fascism, but that's an authoritarian response that the only reason I, and therefore you, didn't win is because of the system against you. And he has outriders, such as Elon Musk, and the Wall Street Journal has been reporting that there are a number of very rich and supportive Republicans around him who are already preparing for this idea of an assault on democracy if Trump were to lose, and the drift towards civil war. And that, I think, does put us in a situation where we could be seeing a far more tense response to an election than you would see in a country where, whatever you might criticize left and right, you wouldn't be using the terminology of fascism.
Yes, I mean, we do associate fascism with propaganda. Are we saying at this point that Elon Musk is a sort of propagandist for the 2024 generation?
And how he's been using social media, because that's the new element here, isn't it, Camilla, which obviously wasn't with us in the 20th century in Europe when we had fascism and Nazism, is that social media, what role could that play? And Elon Musk and very rich men. So as we mentioned yesterday, Elon Musk has given $75 million to the Trump campaign. Bill Gates has, for the first time, given a huge amount of money to the Harris campaign. And because the use of that money in a social media world is so influential. The idea of unelected power is part of the authoritarian state, that people are able to wield great power because of their riches.
Having said all this, and we've agreed that there are elements which match the description of fascism in Donald Trump and his rhetoric, and indeed his administration, this does smack of desperation from Harris. I mean, don't you think? To start banding around the F word.
There was that old joke, wasn't there? The thinness of a politician's argument is always revealed by how quickly they call their enemy a fascist. People throw the word around like it's confetti, when of course it actually means an incredibly dangerous, nasty, horrific system which led to the deaths of many, many millions of people. Is anyone really saying that that is Donald Trump? And the Democrats appear to be gaining with this idea that Donald Trump is not dangerous, which was the Joe Biden attack. He's a threat to democracy. They were much better in the, he's just weird.
Yes.
Isn't he odd? Why would you bother voting for him? Because he's the kind of person who doesn't know how to be president.